Good afternoon. Actually, it's afternoon, and welcome Ingrid Mayrhofer. Did I get that right, Ingrid?
It's close. It's
It's
Mayrhofer.
close.
Thank
Okay.
thank you for having me, Francesca.
Thank you for being my guest here on my channel of Hope and Inspiration. Ingrid, you are actually the first artist to be interviewed online for Culture Days in collaboration with the Cultural Center in Halton Hills. So, Ingrid, are you ready to get started?
Sure.
Okay. First, let me just tell our listeners a little bit about your background. You're a visual artist, curator, arts educator, and a community arts practitioner of European background. You have attended George Brown College, where your studies were in the screen process printing, as well as studies York University. And you've also exhibited globally. So Ingrid, on your website, you say that you've placed your art production in its social context. What would you like to say to our listeners about yourself as an artist?
So I think in that context that you're referring to is that I was an activist before I became an artist. I studied art later in life. I was a mature student. And when I studied art at York University in the 80s, painting had been pronounced dead, okay? And making objects was really frowned upon. So as a mature student, I did take my studies very seriously, and I also took a lot of social science courses in gender studies, in human rights, and because I'd already been involved in solidarity work, so at what I was also involved in the women's movement and in the peace movement. So I intended to make art that was situated in that framework of social justice, of issues. And I wanted to create imagery that would reflect my commitment. And I majored in printmaking and photography for a number of reasons, but primarily because I perceived the print media to be more accessible to a larger audience. So it was more about access to the public, for people to be able to relate to it, to understand the narrative. And I made a lot of political posters in the 80s. And now I still work in a context of social issues, but I work more in collaboration in a community context.
So your work is more in a collaboration in a community.
Yes, with people. I work with youth, I work with neighbors, I work, with community groups and in a collaboration. So, I would do a workshop and they would work in their own creative project. So it's not about so much for me as to have the didactic content of a political poster, but the actual engagement that people get through my work.
Okay, so then how has your art been a reflection of your life experiences?
So my life experiences, especially in my earlier work, was inherently feminist, because being an artist has always been more difficult for women. So I was at the university at a time, I was privileged to have gender studies, on my side, and putting everything in that context. All my own life experiences all of a sudden made sense. And even though we have not achieved equity at this time, the 80s were a time when the push to change a sexist system was much more evident. It was much more, or at least maybe I was more engaged at the time, because I know there's still a strong women's movement. There's, the Me Too movement. There are women who are struggling now and struggling to have change, which we obviously didn't succeed in implementing, but it's come a long way. And the artwork world at large was totally male dominated in the 80s. It still is to a great extent, but not the way it was in the 80s. And, I had my share of conflict with male professors, with my male peers, and people at the time. I had learned at the time that my personal experience was political. And for me, that completely changed the context of how I saw myself. But a lot of the dominant culture, that included the male professors, they would take the political personally. right? Instead of looking at how the personal experience was political, they looked at it as, oh, these women, you know, are threatening my position, right? And so it's really
Okay.
interesting learning experience for
Okay.
me at the time. And I think we have this now too with, you know, Black Lives Matter. You just need to look at the response by some people from the dominant culture who take this as a personal attack that they don't matter, and completely misunderstanding the, you know, the point of the struggle and the call for justice, right? So this was in the 80s, we had it more with the women's movement. And,
Okay.
you know, I went through that, and it really influenced me a lot as an artist, you know, to go through these experiences.
That leads me to my next question perfectly, which is what artists have been a source of inspiration, guidance, and influence for you?
And that's a very difficult one because, you know, I'm now a senior artist, I'm older, I'm not that young, a person who is influenced by everything around me. And, you know, I have a wall full of books, and I have books in boxes of all the artists whose work I admired. But I was thinking back about my earlier time when I entered art school. And at that time, I had a really clear sense of who my role models were. You know, before I went to art school, and I still do admire, you know, people like Francisco Goya and Kate Kornwitz, who were artists who illustrated, you know, struggles and suffering and, you know, social justice issues from their time. But then when I studied art, it kind of broadened my horizon a lot. And at the same time, my idols from before my art studies kind of faded. They kind of faded into the background. So the artist whose work I consider influential now is not necessarily about influencing me as much as that they affirm that the fact that I believe that contemporary art can be meaningful in a social context. And I'm looking at a lot of indigenous artists, for example, Rebecca Belmore, Shelley Nero, Brian Jungen, and many more whose work is very culturally specific, but they also address those specific issues through an aesthetic that reaches a broad audience. Okay, and in my opinion, they are able to raise awareness and educate a viewer at a certain through their artistic language, and instead of the very didactic kind of narrative that I would think, you know, I see now Goya might be perceived as, or Kate Kornwitz, or even some of the, you know, the realists whose work I really like. Courbet, I loved Courbet before I studied art, because of the realism and the didactic nature of their imagery, showing, you know, people who were at work, people who were struggling. And so that's really changed. I've really changed my opinion on that. And I'm not expecting, you know, art to necessarily carry a direct message, right? And it's more about the larger framework, the context, and how they preserve. And with indigenous artists in particular, they manifest, you know, indigenous culture as being First Nations culture, right? So it's there without necessarily being illustrating the issues or being didactic about it. And kind of in contrast to my expectation for art to carry a message, to be, you know, to have a content, I started really appreciating William Morris. He's probably more familiar as a designer of what is now very expensive wallpaper from the arts and crafts movement of the late 19th century, but he came from a wealthy background, so he was also a little bit of an idealist, of course, a socialist idealist. But what I really like about him was the fact that he understood that poor people who were underprivileged, also had a need for beauty in their homes. That it wasn't just because I'm poor, I'm not going to have ugly things, right? And that was, to me, was very innovative, because it's very different to some of the political attitudes now, you know, that he understood that people wanted to things that were meaningful, that were beautiful. And that really also resonates with my upbringing, because I was brought up in a relatively poor, proletarianized peasant household in rural Austria. And, you know, my mom was always making beautiful things. And she wouldn't serve a meal that wasn't beautiful. It had to, there had to be parsley on top to contrast with your tomato soup. And just because they were
Right.
simple working people didn't mean that they didn't appreciate art and beauty and literature. I think my family probably read more than, what some contemporary people now do when they have all the access to everything. So
But
I
I think
appreciate that
with
about
that
artists.
with that European background, as you speak to it from your own upbringing with your family, what they understood was art, if you will, is for everybody, and that it is all in the presentation.
Yeah, yeah. And,
Yeah.
and there was, of course, there was a huge elite and a difference between what the elite had access to and what, ordinary people had access to. But there was more, in a way, availability, and we didn't have a lot of art class, but it was there. And I'm looking at some of my students now, they're getting nothing. They're not getting any art education, in the public schools. And
Right.
so I think we had more of an opportunity, and learning was seen, different as a different kind of, at a larger issue, for kids to learn about art.
So how, Ingrid, would you say that you have developed your career?
So that's another really difficult question for me, because I never set out, when I started to study art, I don't know what I was thinking, but for me, it was more of a philosophical quest. I didn't set out to think that I would make a living by selling my artwork. And I still perceive the commercial gallery scene as unfair to artists. When you think that they take 50%, for nothing, it's a huge issue for me. And so I've never been able to really reconcile that. And I've always preferred to exhibit in public galleries and artist-run centers. And I completely believe in the Canadian Arts Council grant system, because it's not just about getting money, which it is, of course, but it's also about peer recognition. When my peers think that I deserve a mid-career grant, to me that is, an incredible recognition of what I've done. And so I know some people don't, agree with people getting grants, and they think we should just be standing on a street corner and selling our work, but that's not how I see it. And so I would encourage, young artists to go after those grants and, go after exhibitions where you get an artist fee. Imagine the concept. You get paid for showing your art in an institution like a public gallery. They all have really good policies, rather than having to pay, a commercial gallery to show your work. So to me, there's some things that I just can't reconcile. And so as far as my career or my work career, I went into arts administration, which is also a roller coaster. So I worked in curatorial position, programming coordinator, as a grants officer, and art education. And that work in arts administration didn't necessarily help my studio practice, because there's a lot of labor that goes into your studio practice, a lot of labor that's not visible in the final work. And for me, yes, when I look at a print, I know what labor went into that printmaking. But as a customer, as a gallery visitor, people don't have a sense of how much time and energy, physical labor, goes into an artwork. And a lot of times, I just like to sit around in the studio and let it sink in. And you can't do that when you have a kid to feed, or a mortgage to pay, or things like that. So I think it's a really difficult situation, and one that I don't think I'll ever be able to reconcile. So I focused on art education, on giving workshops, teaching, and working in community art, just not only just to support myself, because those are income generating activities, but also I can reach a larger public by teaching. And people who work on community art collaborations, they start to develop an appreciation for the art and for the work of art and for artists themselves. So when people have the hands-on experience, I think it's very different than just go to a gallery and look at the artwork. It's when you're doing it yourself, you realize what goes into it. Yeah.
Right. So as an arts administrator, you didn't necessarily find that role particularly fulfilling. However, through teaching, through education, you found working as an independent to be much more fulfilling for you.
Yes, and it allowed me to actually have studio work, because when I'm teaching, I have to make something in order to be teaching it. So there was more. It reconciled, that the need for me to generate an income with
Right.
actually being creative and being in the studio.
And some of your work includes the etchings, the pottery, calligraphs, the relief paintings, drawings, photographs. And when I went to your website, from what I've seen and what stuck with me, was from the pottery. There was the steins, those beer steins that you have there. I know there's a backstory to that. There was the stoneware with the relief prints, these little animals. And I had told you before, it was that little fox that really caught my eye. And I know there's a story behind the fox, and the plate work as well. Very beautiful. So tell us a little bit about that. The drawings as well, those inkjet, those prints. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's kind of goes with when I have a good idea. It's, I don't have that many good ideas. I have maybe one good idea a year. And so I want to really develop that, express it in every possible way that I can. And I'll give you an example. You probably find that on my website too, is a project that I started in 1999, where I cleared a half an acre of bush on an abandoned farm. And I planted 300 Christmas trees, and that was intended as an intervention, culture, nature, the juxtaposition of the exploration and intervention with nature from a cultural thing. And from that, I go and I still prune the trees. Now they've grown way over my head, and I need a ladder to go up and shape them. But I'm constantly, imposing my culture onto those trees, which a lot of them are European too. I think the balsam fir comes from Europe, or, this is all
right.
There's farming, even though there was farming before contact, most of the farming practices now are more European. So even working with the land is a cultural imposition. So I've taken that, and then I've also taken that land to give me as a source of inspiration for a lot of other projects. Like, for example, my appreciation for native plants has grown through my European, Eurocentric intervention with the land. I'm looking at now, what would be the native plants that would have been there or would be there if those trees, hadn't been planted, or if the farm hadn't been abandoned and overgrown with weeds, because not all the plants that grow into a farm that's abandoned are native. A lot of them are introduced, and even native plants, they can be invasive, like poison ivy. It's a very North American native. So there are all these questions that really fascinate me about culture and nature, like what is actual nature without our cultural intervention. So that's where I've gone with that. And
you also have that series of photographs that I was really drawn to. We spoke of it earlier briefly. You had boat on the lake, you had chairs by the lake, and those roadside chairs. I thought that was great.
Yeah, and I thank you for saying that, because it's a body of work that I haven't really shown a lot, because it's sort of complicated. It's a lot of work, to get your art shown. Like, first of all, it's work to make your art. And, when you're talking about photographs, I used to be in a dark room, and the photograph, you take it in a snap of a second, but then you're in the dark room, or you're in Photoshop, and you're putting it all together. So there's a lot of labor that goes into it that's not shown. And I kind of took those photographs to actually reflect on that idea of the object and the work that it performed when it was in use. So all those photographs that you're referring to are actually kind of taken at a time when an object has served its purpose, and people either toss it away, or in the case of the boat that you were mentioning on the lake, it's covered up because the people have closed down their cottage, and it's all sealed off for the winter, and those objects continue to be there without really having a function, because the function of the object is determined by the human, right? So it's just sitting there, it's covered, and it's waiting for people to either uncover it next spring. And I was fascinated by that thought, that you can make an object, you buy an object, and then you just leave it, or throw it out like the roadside chairs. Yeah, and toss it, and they're actually, you know, interfering with somebody else's space because it's public space where these things are
Right.
tossed by the roadside.
Right. And I was saying to you earlier that I had such an appreciation for that going up to the cottage for many, many years. I would see all of those roadside plastic chairs.
Yeah.
And so that's why I was really drawn into that photograph when I had seen it. So, Ingrid, I understand that you're actually going to be doing a workshop at the Culture Center for Culture Days next month. It's going to be October 17th, and it's the relief print work that you're going to be doing, you said, in a couple of shifts. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So that's a very basic approach to relief printing where we use styrofoam plates instead of a printmaking block. And
Okay.
people, you know, when you ever played with styrofoam plates or cups, you know, and you make a mark with your nail, it leaves a mark. Okay. So there's a groove, and that's what relief printing is about. It's all about having a groove that, and when you roll the ink over it, over the plate, you know, you have to sort of think like you have a brayer to roll ink over this plate, and where you made your groove, the ink doesn't sink in. Okay, so this is the opposite of other printmaking methods where you want the ink to be in the groove instead. But so with relief printing, and so you can use anything. Like when you step, you know, in water with your footprint, your shoe print, and then you step on the sidewalk, you make a print. So there's a couple of things, you know, that you look at when you're making a print. First of all, it's an original because it's not a copy, because your plate is the matrix and it's kind of giving you multiples.
Right.
And so there are all original prints and not reproductions, but it's also, you have to think in reverse, because when you press down the line, that's the one that's not going to be printing, right? So it's a reverse of thinking. It's also going to be a mirror image, because every time, you know, you leave a thumbprint, it's a mirror image of your thumb. And so I love those considerations of printmaking, because there's so much you have to plan, so much to think about. But I know that when people do it and they pull their first print, there is always this element of surprise, because it's really difficult to visualize what you're going to get. So you ink up your foam plate, even if it's the simplest, most basic, you know, piece of styrofoam, and you have your mark on it, and you roll ink over it, and then you put the paper on it, you pull it, there's a surprise. And I like that, you know, about workshops with people, especially with people who have not done printmaking before, because they really don't have that expectation. It's more difficult to work, you know, with artists who think you're going to produce some kind of miracle in 20 minutes, you know, so yeah, so the idea, of course, we have to also consider the limitations of COVID-19. So I can't be doing a workshop for 20 people at a time. So they'll do very brief shifts and clean up in between, and make sure that everybody is safe and still gets a good experience.
It sounds like it's going to be an exciting workshop. And I hope it goes really well. I think it's going to be fantastic. And as you say, you're taking the proper measures to make sure that you're going to be doing this in small groups. So again, that was going to be on the 17th of October. And I think you said it was the actual workshop is running from 2 to 4 in the afternoon.
Yes, people can sign up for a 20-minute slot between.
A 20-minute slot.
Okay. They'll have to contact the cultural center
and register.
And register.
Okay. So in speaking of this printmaking process, brings me to our next question. How do you know, Ingrid, when a work is finished?
So this is a very good question. Okay. It really, in that context, I think it really depends on the medium. Like when I work in printmaking and in pottery, the media totally determine or set the parameters for, you know, that creative process. Like with printmaking, I make a plate. Okay, I create a plate or a block or some kind of matrix that reaches a state where you can't take it any further. And we were talking about the collagraphs earlier. Yeah. Collagraph is a cardboard, you know, plate with layers glued onto it, and you ink it. And once you've laid all your layers down and you glued them down, it's varnished and you can't, manipulate it any further. So that's it. And if you don't like it, so you either pull your plate or you start over, but that is the plate that sets that tone, right? And with pottery, it's even more strict, because when you throw a pot, it knows when it's finished, and if you fiddle with it too much, it'll collapse. So
Right.
kind of, that kind of, and I was talking a little bit about photography earlier. It's a little bit different, because so much of the work of finishing a photograph is done after you've taken that fraction of a second, and kind of captured that moment with the camera, and then you have to work on it after. But it's also, the darkroom process, once you've fixed an image, it's fixed, you've washed it and you fix it and that's it. And so it's done. And for me, it's a lot more difficult with drawings and paintings. And I have, a lot of work in drawers that is waiting for me to finish it. And I like that part as well, because sometimes I go back to something that I did 3 years ago. And if I don't remember, what it was supposed to be or was supposed to be about, then obviously it wasn't finished. And and
Right.
then I kind of carry that on, because it's a very difficult question, especially I can see with painters. I've known painters who would destroy a painting because they've gone too far with it. And, it's a difficult question for artists, I think, to know.
That's fair. That's fair.
I tend to overwork things. So that's why I like the limitations that printmaking puts on me.
Okay.
Because you've got the plate, and then that's it. You've done it.
Okay. So in looking at your background, actually, I noticed there are some pieces that you have on your wall there. And it just made me think about, what element of your work do you enjoy the most, working with the most, particular themes that you might pursue, and why?
Uh, that's, again, it's a difficult question, because it sort of evolves. When I started a project, it kind of develops, and sometimes it goes into different directions. And I'm always looking for, mostly I would say I'm probably more driven by the content of something I want to say. And so then I have to look for the form or for the medium. And so I would probably, if I had a story, let's say I have a narrative, like you were referencing my little story of the fox and the grapes. And there's a way of doing that in printmaking, but there would be a different way of doing it, on a pot, for example. It wouldn't be the same form. It would come out differently. So the story would come out differently. And what I've done with the collagraphs, and I don't know, you haven't asked the question yet, but I'm going to pitch it anyway, because I'm really excited
That's
about
okay.
being part of an upcoming exhibition at the Helsen Gallery, which is about climate change. And I've got a few collagraphs in that, where, again, there's, I remember I said it was a cardboard plate. And so I have additional pieces that are also cardboard or paper, and I've cut them out and arranged them differently. Okay, so every one of those, the 4 prints that I have in there, they have exactly the same pieces, but I've laid them out differently. So you get the 4 elements. Okay, you get fire, water, air, and earth, and it's a narrative that evolved as I was looking at the little pieces and then put them together, and I laid them out differently. So that's the part I really like, is really pushing my idea, because like I said earlier, I may only have one good idea a year. So I have to really push that idea and make it work for me. So, that's, and again, now what I'm looking at too is from the narrative that I've started, I'm getting more from that inspiration that I got from William Morris, is how can I turn it into a pattern? Okay, once you've got something, the patterns from nature are endless. And so there really is no limit to what I can do with, let's say I start out with an orchid, and I dissect it and I look at it and I create a pattern from that. And I've started working on that. It doesn't come easily to me, because, I've never really been that much about the decorative arts, but I'm starting to appreciate that more, because it just gives me pleasure to look at something beautiful, and why shouldn't I?
Okay. What you were talking about was, you were talking about the Helsen Gallery, and it sounds like you're going to be on exhibit there for a particular theme around the environment, is it?
Yes, it's an exhibition.
When is that going to
It's
be,
in
Ingrid?
November. I think it's later in November. I'm not
November.
exactly sure of the dates,
Okay.
the exact dates, but yes, my friend Damaris Sepulveda, who is based in Vancouver, and I came up with this idea of working around, issues around climate change and natural disasters that are not natural. They're unnatural disasters. And so we evolved those themes. Been talking about it for a while. And so she's presenting a series of volcanoes in that same exhibition. And I'm putting in my four elements.
Okay, great. So we have lots to look forward to from you. And I do want to know if you could tell us what your most inspirational place would be, if it could be anywhere in the world.
So again, and my life has been kind of all over the place, because I am an immigrant. So I came from somewhere else and it took me a while to adjust. And I've never really felt particularly tied to a geographic location.
Okay.
Instead, I have that sense from, I think it's from the German Romanticism, that you're always longing for another place. So when I'm in some place, I'm longing for something else. And I explored that theme in an exhibition about 20 years ago with a group of friends of mine, Amelia Jimenez and Ron Edding, Satko Hadjiasanovic, and Gu Zhang. Gu Zhang, by the way, whose print of the bicycle barricade is up here. I don't know if you can see it. It's
Yeah.
He left China after the Tiananmen Square massacre, and he teaches in UBC now. And so we were looking at what is this place that we're longing for, that we're looking for, and the exhibition happened in an exchange with Serbia. So I loved Vršac. It was just an absolutely fascinating place, and we were there just towards the end of that ongoing Balkan conflict, the tension that they had there. And so we were looking for a place where we could bring people together, where we could weave together, our understanding of what united us, what brought us together as a place of peace, as a place of belonging. Okay, so it was more about that rather than the geographic location, because conflict, is happening everywhere in the world. And we were looking for the place that takes you out of the geography of conflict into a place of belonging. So, and what keeps me going as an artist is really a place where conversation happens. So, around my kitchen table with my friends, that's where I get my own personal inspiration from. And I really hope that we'll be able to do that again soon, because I miss it. The collaborating with people, with artists and non-artists, that give you that creative space, which is, not tied to a time or a geographic location. It's just that space in your head really is where that is.
So what you're currently working on is with the workshop at the Cultural Center in October, November. You do have the exhibit coming up. Is there anything else that you're working on, Ingrid, that you want to share, perhaps if not for this year, for next year?
There is a project in the planning. I don't know what's going to happen now with galleries at the Clay and Glass Gallery in Waterloo. The project that I'm doing for that connects printmaking and pottery. So I've taken lithography is another printmaking process, and I love doing lithographs on clay. It's very finicky, of course, but I like that that challenge of doing something finicky. And I'm working with old photographs from my mom's side of the family. And mostly I've selected photographs that illustrate her family's, my dad's side of the family's search for a place to belong after they had to flee their birthplace towards the end of World War II. So those are photographs, of my mom and her family. It was very kind of, it was not necessarily like a matriarchal structure, because they had the patriarch above them, but you can see that all the work is done by the women. So it was kind of my great-grandmother, my mother, it was all the women who determined, what the work was going to be. And yes, they had the man there as the patriarch, but it's so interesting to me that in the photographs how little, they're present you know, it's mostly the women. So I
Right.
wanted to work with that idea, you know, of my mom's side of the family. I've never really done much about the personal sort of family history, and it seemed like a good fit for that theme that the gallery proposed. And I'm
Wonderful.
excited
So
to
that is
share
something
it.
else for us to look forward to. That was for next year, and that was clay and glass, and that was going to be in Waterloo.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're getting to the end of this, Ingrid, but I'd like to know what you like most about Culture Days.
So Culture Days, I think it's been going on now for almost 20 years. And, you know, to me, it's amazing how it has evolved and
Mm.
the opportunities that it gives to artists and audiences to connect. Like for me, it's always important to have somebody else help me reach an audience because I'm not very good at marketing. You know, I have a website, but it's really bad. And I forget to post things on Instagram. So I appreciate those. Yeah, it's just hard. I appreciate those opportunities that are presented, you know, through public galleries, through museums, to allow me to connect with the public. And I think that's, for me, is, you know, I wouldn't be going out there organizing a workshop by myself, right?
Right.
If the cultural center uh, at Halton Hills didn't do it, there's no way I'm going to go. We have done that with the collect. I work with an artist collective as well. And for one of the culture days in the past, I don't know, 2 years ago, we just put up a tent on a trail and we set up a printmaking workshop for people to drop in and do their own. But again, it was within the framework of either Culture Days or Arts Week in Hamilton. So I need that larger framework, and I really appreciate that about, you know, things like Arts Weeks and Culture Days, where there is somebody else working on getting it happening. And even though I think, you know, I think I mentioned this before, that I was a bit skeptical in the beginning when it started because there weren't direct
Mhm.
sort of paid opportunities for artists where, you know, the people who started Culture Days said, okay, we're going to hire you and you and you to start this workshop. So it wasn't there. It was left up to organizations to participate. It has evolved into something that I find is a really useful tool, you know, for artists and for the public. So,
Right.
right.
Right. And we are really going to be looking forward to your workshop in October. Even if I can get there, I'd like to drop in. So I'll be keeping an eye on that. And Ingrid, that is all we have time for today. So before we go, if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, what do they have to do next? How can we connect with you? Where and how are you available?
Well, I do have a website. That's my full name.ca. So Ingrid Mayrhofer.ca. Maybe.
There's the pronunciation. I know, right? But
And I
anyways.
do have, yeah, I have an Instagram account that is kind of my studio account, and
Okay.
it's Retro Deco with a K, retro underscore deco with a K on Instagram. And I also have a lot of my arts education and community art activities are on the collective website, and that's redtreecollective.ca. And from
Red.
my website, like once you find one, you will find the links to the others. So they are
Okay.
connected. Yeah,
Okay.
that's
I
it.
can't thank you. I can't thank you enough for your time, Ingrid. I mean, I hope you've enjoyed the time telling all of us about your work, your body of work, your life's experiences that have inspired all of what you create, and your insights are wonderful. So thank you so much for sharing today with all of us. And to the listeners, if you have enjoyed today's conversation, to remember to like and share this video. Ingrid, until next time, thank you so much.
Thank you, Francesca, and I hope that we'll meet in person sometime soon.
Most definitely.
Okay.
Bye for now, Ingrid.
Have a good Sunday. Bye.